Child sexuality. Sigmund Freud. Child sexuality. The neglect of the child. Part of the popular opinion about the sexual drive is the affirmation that it is absent in childhood and only awakens in the period of life called puberty. This is not just any mistake, it has serious consequences, since it is the main culprit for our present ignorance about the basis of sexual life. An in-depth study of the sexual manifestations of childhood would probably reveal to us the essential features of the sexual drive, would reveal its development, and would show that it is composed of various sources. Remarkable thing, the authors who were busy explaining the properties and reactions of the adult individual paid much more attention to the prehistory constituted by the life of the ancestors, that is to say, they attributed a much greater influence to heredity, than to the other prehistory, which is already presented in individual existence, childhood. And that, as it should be supposed, the influence of this period of life is easier to understand, and would have titles to be considered before that of heredity. 1. It is true that in the bibliography we find occasional news about a sexual practice early in young children, about erections, masturbation, and even actions resembling coitus. But they are always mentioned as exceptional processes, as curiosities, or as horrifying examples of early corruption. As far as I know, no author has clearly recognized that the existence of a sexual drive in childhood has the character of a law. And in the already numerous writings on child development, sexual development is almost always omitted. Child amnesia. The reason for this astonishing oversight I seek partly in the conventional qualms of authors as a result of their own upbringing, and partly in a psychic phenomenon that has hitherto eluded explanation. I refer to the peculiar amnesia that in most human beings, not all, covers the first years of their childhood, up to the 6th or 8th year of life. Up to now it has not occurred to us to be astonished at the fact of this amnesia, but we would have good reasons for it. Indeed, we are told that in those years, of which we later retain in memory only a few incomprehensible shreds, we reacted vivaciously to impressions, we knew how to express pain and joy in a human way, we showed love, jealousy, and other passions. They then shook us violently, and we even uttered phrases that the adults registered as good evidence of penetration and of an incipient capacity for judgment. And once adults, none of that we know for ourselves. Why did our memory lag so far behind our other mental activities? Especially when we have grounds to believe that in no other period of life is the capacity for reproduction and reception greater, precisely, than in childhood. On the other hand, we have to assume, or we can be convinced of it by the psychological investigation of other people, that these same impressions that we have forgotten, nevertheless, left the deepest traces in our mental life and became determinative for our entire life. Later development. It cannot be a question, then, of a real disappearance of infantile impressions, but of an amnesia similar to that which we observe in neurotics regarding later experiences and whose essence consists in a mere withdrawal of consciousness, repression. Now, what are the forces that cause this repression of infantile impressions? Whoever solves this riddle will have cleared up hysterical amnesia at the same time. In any case, we will not fail to emphasize that the existence of infantile amnesia provides another point of comparison between the mental state of the child and that of the psychoneurotic. We already found a similar point when the formula was imposed on us that the sexuality of psychoneurotics preserves the infantile state or has been relegated to it. And what if infantile amnesia itself should be related to the sexual impulses of childhood? In truth, it is more than a mere game of wits to link infantile amnesia with hysterical amnesia. The latter, which is at the service of repression, can only be explained by the fact that the individual already possesses a stock of memory traces that have been withdrawn from his conscious access and that now, by means of an associative link, he drags towards himself. That on which the repulsive forces of repression act, from consciousness * without infantile amnesia, we could say, there would be no hysterical amnesia. In my opinion, then, infantile amnesia, which converts each individual's childhood into an earlier time, so to speak prehistoric, and hides from him the beginnings of his own sexual life, is to blame for not giving value to the period child in the development of sexual life. A single observer cannot fill in the gaps that this has engendered in our knowledge. Already in 1896 I highlighted the relevance of the childhood years for the genesis of certain important phenomena, dependent on sexual life, and since then I have not ceased to bring to the forefront the infantile factor of sexuality. The period of sexual latency of childhood and its ruptures. The extraordinarily frequent findings of sexual impulses that were believed to be exceptions and atypical cases in childhood, as well as the revelation of the childhood memories of neurotics, hitherto unconscious, perhaps allow us to draw the following picture of sexual behavior in that period. It seems safe that the newborn brings with it germs of sexual impulses that continue to develop for a certain period, but then suffer a progressive suffocation. This, in turn, can be broken by regular waves of advancement of sexual development or suspended by individual peculiarities. Nothing certain is known about the legal character and periodicity of this oscillating path of development. It seems, however, that almost always towards the third or fourth year of the child's life his sexuality is expressed in a form accessible to observation. The sexual inhibitions. During this period of total or merely partial latency, the psychic powers are built up that will later present themselves as inhibitions in the path of the sexual drive and will narrow its course in the manner of dams, disgust, the feeling of shame, the ideal claims in the aesthetic and in the moral. In the civilized child one has the impression that the establishment of these dikes is the work of education, and without a doubt it contributes a lot. But in reality this development is of organic conditioning, hereditarily fixed, and if necessary it can take place without any help from education. The latter adheres entirely to the sphere of competence that has been assigned to it when it limits itself to marching after what is organically established, giving it a somewhat more orderly and profound imprint. Reactive formation and sublimation. With what means? Are these constructions so important for the subsequent personal culture and normality of the individual executed? Probably at the expense of the infantile sexual impulses themselves, whose influx has not ceased, therefore, even in this period of latency, but whose energy wholly or for the most part is diverted from sexual use and applied to other ends. Historians of culture seem unwilling to assume that this diversion of the sexual drive forces from their goals, and their orientation towards new goals, a process that deserves the name of sublimation. Powerful components are acquired for all cultural achievements. We would add, then, that an equal process. It takes place in the development of the individual, and we would locate its beginning in the period of sexual latency of childhood. You can also risk a conjecture about the mechanism of such sublimation. The sexual impulses of these infantile years would be, on the one hand, inapplicable, since the reproduction functions are deferred, which constitutes the main character of the latency period. On the other hand, they would be perverse in themselves, that is, they would start from erogenous zones and would be sustained by drives that, given the direction of development of the individual, would only cause sensations of unpleasure. That is why they arouse contrary psychic forces, reactive motions, that build, for the effective suffocation of this displeasure, the aforementioned psychic dams, disgust, shame, and morality. 10. Breaks in the latency period. Without having any illusions as to the hypothetical nature and the insufficient clarity of our insights into the processes of the infantile period of latency or deferral, let us return to reality to indicate that this use of infantile sexuality constitutes a pedagogical ideal of which development of the individual almost always departs in some points, and often to a considerable extent. From time to time, a block of sexual exteriorization breaks through that has escaped sublimation, or a certain sexual practice is preserved throughout the latency period until the reinforced outbreak of the sexual drive at puberty. Educators, insofar as they provide attention to infantile sexuality, they behave as if they shared our views about the formation of moral defense powers at the expense of sexuality, and as if they knew that sexual practice renders the child unteachable. In effect, they persecute as vices all the sexual expressions of the child, although without achieving much against them. Now we have grounds to be interested in these phenomena feared by education, since we hope that they will clarify for us the original conformation of the sexual drive. The sucker. For reasons that will be seen later, we will take sucking with relish, as a model of infantile sexual expressions, to which the Hungarian pediatrician Lindner has devoted a notable study, 1879. Sucking Ludeln or Luchin, which already appears in the infant and can be preserved until maturity or persist throughout life, consists of a sucking contact with the mouth, lips, rhythmically repeated, which does not have the end of the nutrition. A part of one's own lips, the tongue, a place on the skin that is within reach, even the big toe, are taken as the object on which the action of sucking is performed. A grasping drive that emerges at the same time usually manifests itself by a simultaneous rhythmic pulling of the earlobe and the seizure of a part of another person, almost always his ear, for the same purpose. The action of sucking with relish completely captivates the attention and leads to drowsiness or even to a motor reaction in a kind of orgasm. It is not uncommon for relish sucking to be combined with the rubbing of certain sensitive parts of the body, the chest, the external genitalia. In this way, many children pass from sucking to masturbation. Lindner himself has recognized the sexual nature of this action and has pointed it out without qualms. In upbringing, sucking is often equated with the other sexual bad habits of the child. Many pediatricians and neurologists, they have strongly objected to this conception, but part of his objection doubtless rests on the confusion of sexual with genital. This dissent raises a difficult and unavoidable question: what is the universal character of the child's sexual expressions, which would allow us to recognize them? I believe that the concatenation of phenomena that, thanks to psychoanalytic research, we have been able to understand authorizes us to consider sucking as a sexual expression, and precisely to study in it the essential features of infantile sexual practice. Autoerotism. We have an obligation to further consider this example. Let us highlight, as the most striking character of this sexual practice, the fact that the drive is not directed at another person, it is satisfied in one's own body. It is autoerotic, to say it with a happy designation introduced by Havelock Ellis 1898.13. It is also clear that the action of the pacifier child is governed by the search for a pleasure already experienced, and now remembered. Thus, in the simplest case, satisfaction is obtained by rhythmically sucking a sector of the skin or mucosa. It is also easy to deduce the occasions that gave the child the first experiences of that pleasure that he now aspires to renew. His first activity, the most important in his life, suckling his mother's breast, or that of his surrogates, could not help but familiarize him with that pleasure. We would say that the child's lips behaved like an erogenous zone, and the stimulation by the warm flow of milk was the cause of the pleasant sensation. In the beginning, of course, the satisfaction of the erogenous zone was associated with the satisfaction of the need to feed. The sexual task /onlanen/ is anchored first in one of the functions that serve the preservation of life, and only later does it become independent of it. Whoever sees a sated child falling asleep at the mother's breast, with rosy cheeks and a beatific smile, cannot help but say that this picture continues to be decisive for the expression of sexual satisfaction in later life as well. The need to repeat sexual satisfaction is then divorced from the need to seek food, a divorce that becomes inevitable when the teeth appear and feeding is no longer accomplished exclusively by sucking, but also by chewing. The child does not use a foreign object to suck, he prefers a part of his own skin because it is more comfortable for him, because in this way he becomes independent from the outside world that he cannot yet control, and because in this way he procures, as it were, a second erogenous zone, albeit of lesser value. The lesser value of this second place will lead him later to look in someone else for the corresponding part, the lips. We could imagine him saying, "Too bad I can't kiss myself." Not all children suck. Presumably they arrive to do so those in whom the erogenous value of the area of the lips is constitutionally reinforced. If this persists, such children, reaching adulthood, will be great kiss lovers, will be inclined to perverse kisses or, if they are men, will have a strong intrinsic motivation to drink and smoke. But if the repression comes, they will feel disgust in front of the food and they will produce hysterical vomiting. Since the labial zone is a field of reciprocal action Gemeinsamkeit, the repression will invade the nutrition drive. Many of my patients with disordered eating, globus hystericus, strangulation of the throat, and vomiting were energetic pacifiers in their childhood years. In sucking or sucking with relish we have already observed the three essential characteristics of an infantile sexual expression. This is borne by supporting one of the important bodily functions for life. She does not yet know a sexual object, since she is autoerotic, and her sexual goal is under the rule of an erogenous zone. Let us anticipate that these characteristics are also valid for most of the other practices of the infantile sexual drive. Characters of the erogenous zones. We can still extract a lot from the sucking example in order to characterize what an erogenous zone is. It is a sector of skin or mucosa in which stimulations of a certain type. They cause a pleasant sensation of a certain quality. There is no doubt that pleasure-producing stimuli are linked to particular conditions, but we do not know them. Among them, the rhythmic character cannot but play a role. The analogy with tickling prevails. It seems less certain that the character of the pleasurable sensation provoked by the stimulus can be designated particularity in which the sexual factor would be contained, precisely. In matters of pleasure and displeasure, psychology is still too groping in the dark, so it is advisable to adopt the most cautious hypothesis. Perhaps later we will find grounds that seem to support the particularity as a quality of that pleasant sensation. The erogenous property can prominently adhere to certain parts of the body. There are predestined erogenous zones, as shown by sucking, but this same example also teaches us that any other sector of skin or mucosa can provide the services of an erogenous zone, for which it is bound to entail a certain aptitude. Therefore, for the production of a pleasant sensation, the quality of the stimulus is more important than the complexion of the parts of the body. The pacifier boy searches for his body and chooses some sector to suck it with relish. Later, out of habit, this becomes the favorite. When by chance he stumbles upon one of the predestined sectors, nipples, genitals, this will certainly be the favorite. This capacity for displacement reappears in the symptomatology of hysteria in an entirely analogous way. In this neurosis, the repression affects above all the genital zones in the strict sense, which lend their stimulation to the remaining erogenous zones, which otherwise would remain relegated in adult life. Then, they behave in a whole like the genitals. But, in addition, as in the case of sucking, any other sector of the body can be endowed with the excitability of the genitals and rise to the status of an erogenous zone. The erogenous and hysterogenic zones exhibit the same characters. Child sexual goal. The sexual goal of the infantile drive consists in producing satisfaction through the appropriate stimulation of the erogenous zone that, in one way or another, has been chosen. For a need to repeat it to be created, this satisfaction must have been experienced before, and it is legitimate to think that nature will have taken certain measures so that this experience is not left to chance. Nutrition. We will still have to find other similar devices as sources of sexuality. As a state, the need to repeat satisfaction is revealed by two things: a peculiar feeling of tension, which has rather the character of displeasure, and a sensation centrally conditioned stimulation or itching projected to the peripheral erogenous zone. That is why the sexual goal can also be formulated like this: it would seek to replace the sensation of stimulation projected onto the erogenous zone, by that external stimulus that cancels it by provoking the sensation of satisfaction. This external stimulus will consist most of the time in a manipulation analogous to suckling. But if it is true that the need can also be aroused peripherally, by a real alteration in the erogenous zone, this fact harmonizes perfectly with our physiological knowledge. It only seems a little surprising that one stimulus requires a second stimulus applied to the same place to be cancelled. Masturbatory sexual expressions. It cannot but make us extremely happy to discover that, Once the drive has been studied starting from a single erogenous zone, we do not have many more important things to learn about the child's sexual practice. The most notable differences refer to the steps that need to be taken to obtain satisfaction, which in the case of the labial area consisted of suckling and which will have to be replaced by another muscular action according to the position and complexion of the other areas. Activation of the anal area. The anal zone, like the labial zone, is suitable due to its position to provide a support for sexuality in other bodily functions. It must be admitted that the erogenous value of the sector of the body is originally very great. Through psychoanalysis we learn, not without surprise, the transmutations that the sexual excitations that originate from it normally undergo, and how often it maintains a considerable participation in genital excitability throughout life. Childhood: take care that there is no lack of intense excitement in this area. Intestinal colds at an early age make the child nervous, as they say. If he later develops a neurosis, they have a determining influence on his symptomatic expression and put his disposition the whole sum of intestinal disorders. And with reference to erogenous value of the anal tract, value that is preserved, if not as such, at least in its transmutation, the influence of hemorrhoids cannot be laughed at, to which old medicine gave so much weight for the explanation of neurotic states. Children who take advantage of the erogenous stimulability of the anal area are betrayed by the fact that they retain the feces until the accumulation of these causes strong muscular contractions and, when passing through the anus, they can exert a powerful stimulus on the mucosa vitae. In this way, voluptuous sensations must be produced along with the painful ones. One of the best anticipatory signs of later awkwardness or nervousness is for an infant to stubbornly refuse to empty the bowel when placed on the potty, that is, when the caregiver wishes, reserving this function for when the parent wishes. Same. What interests him, of course, is not dirtying his crib, he's just trying not to miss out on the side gain pleasure he can get from pooping. Again, educators are right when they call children who differ these functions wayward. The contents of the intestines, which, as a stimulating body, behaves towards a sexually sensitive mucosa as the precursor of another organ destined to come into action only after the phase of infancy, has still other important aspects for the infant. Meanings. Obviously, he treats it as a part of his own body. It represents the first gift through which the little being can express its obedience towards the surrounding environment by externalizing it, and its defiance by refusing it. From this meaning of gift, it later takes on that of child, which, according to one of the infantile sexual theories, is acquired through food and is given birth through the intestine. The retention of faces, which is practiced deliberately at first to take advantage of its masturbatory stimulation, so to speak, of the anal zone or to use it in the relationship with the people who take care of the child, is moreover one of the roots of constipation so common in neuropaths. The full significance of the anal zone is also reflected in the fact that very few neurotics are found who do not have their particular scatological uses. Activation of the gnitox zones. Between the zones erogenous of the infantile body, there is one that certainly does not play the main role nor can it be the bearer of the oldest sexual impulses, but which is destined for great things in the future. In both boys and girls it is related to urination, glands, clitoris, and in the former it is inside a mucus sac, so that it cannot lack stimulation by secretions, which are capable of igniting excitement from early on. Sexual. The sexual activations of this erogenous zone, which corresponds to the actual sexual parts, are undoubtedly the beginning of the subsequent normal sexual life. Because of their anatomical situation, because of the overflow of secretions, because of the washing and rubbing of body care, and because of certain accidental excitations, such as the migration of intestinal worms in girls, it is inevitable that the pleasant sensation that these parts of the body are capable of provide is made noticeable to the child already in his lactation period, awakening in him a need to repeat it. If the sum of these circumstances is considered and it is noticed that the measures adopted to maintain cleanliness will hardly have effects other than those produced by their dirtiness, it becomes almost forced to conclude that through infant onanism, which almost no individual suffers from. Escapes, the future primacy of this erogenous zone is established, for sexual activity 0. The action that eliminates the stimulus and triggers satisfaction consists in a rubbing contact with the hand or in a pressure, undoubtedly prefigured as a reflex, exerted by the hand or by squeezing the thighs. This last operation is by far the most frequent in the girl. In the case of the boy, the preference for the hand already indicates the important contribution that the drive to seize is destined to make to the activity male sex. It will be in the interest of clarity 28 to indicate that it is necessary to distinguish 3 phases in infantile masturbation. The first corresponds to the lactation period, the second to the brief flowering of sexual practice around the 4th year of life, and only the third responds to the onanism of puberty, the only one that is usually taken into account. The second phase of infant masturbation. Infant onanism seems to disappear after a short time, nevertheless, its uninterrupted continuation until puberty may already constitute the first great deviation from the development that is aspired for the human being in culture. After the period of lactation, at some point in childhood, usually before the 4th year, the sexual drive usually awakens again in this genital area and lasts for a while, until a new suffocation stops it, or continues without interruption. The possible relationships are very diverse and can only be elucidated by the most detailed examination of individual cases. But all the details of this second childhood sexual activation leave behind the deepest, unconscious, traces in the person's memory, determine the development of his character if he remains healthy, and the symptoms of his neurosis if he falls ill after puberty. In the latter case, we find that this sexual period has been forgotten, and the conscious memories that attest to it have been displaced. I have already said that I would also link normal infantile amnesia with this infantile sexual activation. Through psychoanalytic exploration, it is possible to make the forgotten conscious and, in this way, eliminate a compulsion that starts from the unconscious psychic material. Return of lactation masturbation. The sexual arousal from the lactation period returns in the indicated childhood years. It may do so as a centrally conditioned itching stimulus that calls for masturbatory satisfaction, or as a process of the type of pollution, which, analogous to the pollution of the Middle Age, achieves satisfaction without the aid of any action. This last case is the most frequent in girls, and in the second half of childhood, he is not well known in his conditioning, and often though not regularly seems to be premised on a period of earlier active onanism. The symptomatology of these sexual expressions is poor. The urinary system almost always bears witness to the still undeveloped sexual apparatus, which appears, as it were, as its spokesperson. Most of the so-called bladder affections of this time are sexual disturbances. Nocturnal enuresis, when it does not respond to an epileptic attack, corresponds to pollution. Internal causes and external occasions are decisive for the reappearance of sexual activity. In cases of neurosis, both can be inferred from the conformation of the symptoms and discovered with certainty by psychoanalytic examination. Of the internal causes we will speak later. Contingent external occasions at this time assume great and lasting importance. In the first place is the influence of seduction, which prematurely treats the child as a sexual object and, in circumstances that cannot but make a strong impression on him, teaches him to know the satisfaction of the genital areas. The sequel to this is almost always the compulsion to renew it through onanism. Such an influence can come from adults or from other children. I cannot concede that in my essay on the etiology of hysteria I have overestimated its frequency or its importance, although it is true that at the time I did not yet know that individuals who remained normal could have had these same experiences in their childhood. Which is why I placed more value on seduction than on the factors given in sexual constitution and development. Point 3. It is evident that seduction is not required to awaken the sexual life of the child, and that this awakening can also take place spontaneously from internal causes. Polymorphic perverse disposition. It is instructive that under the influence of seduction the child can become a perverse polymorph, being misled into practicing all possible transgressions. This shows that in his disposition he brings with him the aptitude for it. Such transgressions meet with little resistance because, depending on the child's age, the psychic dams against sexual excesses have not yet been erected or are in formation: shame, disgust, and morality. In this the child does not behave differently from the ordinary, uncultivated woman, in whom the same polymorphous perverse disposition is preserved. Under ordinary conditions, she can remain sexually normal. Guided by a skillful seducer, she will find pleasure in all perversions and will retain them in her sexual practice. That same polymorphous disposition, and therefore infantile, is what the prostitute exploits in her trade, and in the immense number of prostitutes and of those to whom it is necessary to attribute the aptitude for prostitution, although they escaped from practicing it, it is impossible not to recognize something common to all human beings, something that has its origins in the uniform disposition to all perversions. Partial pools ions. For the rest, the influence of seduction does not help to discover the initial condition of the sexual drive, but confuses our intellection of it, insofar as it prematurely provides the child with the sexual object, of which the infantile sexual drive does not show at the beginning any need. In any case, we have to admit that childhood sexual life, despite the dominance exercised by erogenous zones, shows components that from the beginning involve other people as sexual objects. Of this nature are the drives for the pleasure of seeing and exhibiting, and for cruelty. They appear with a certain independence with respect to the erogenous zones, and only later do they enter into close relations with genital life, but they already become noticeable in childhood as autonomous aspirations, separated at the beginning from erogenous sexual activity. Above all, the little boy lacks shame, and in certain early years shows an unmistakable delight in bearing his body with particular emphasis on his genitalia. The correspondent of this so-called perverse inclination, the curiosity to see other people's genitals, probably becomes manifest only a little later in childhood, when the pitfall of the feeling of shame has already developed to some extent. Under the influence of seduction, the perversion of seeing can become very important for the child's sexual life. However, my explorations of the childhood of healthy people and of neurotics have led me to conclude that the drive to see can emerge in the child as a spontaneous sexual externalization. Young children whose attention has once been directed to their own genitalia usually masturbate or usually take the next step without outside input, and develop a keen interest in the genitalia of their playmates. Since the occasion to satisfy this curiosity almost always presents itself only by satisfying the two excrementary needs, these children become voyeurs, fervent observers of the urination and defecation of others. Once these inclinations have been repressed, the curiosity to see other people's genitals, of one's own sex or of the other, remains a tormenting pressure, which in many cases of neurosis then lends the strongest driving force to the formation of symptoms. With even greater independence from other sexual practices linked to the erogenous zones, the cruel components of the sexual drive develop in the child. Cruelty is an entirely natural thing in the childish character. Indeed, the inhibition by virtue of which the drive to see stops when faced with the pain of the other, the ability to sympathize, develop relatively late. It is notorious that an exhaustive psychological analysis of this drive has not yet been achieved. It is legitimate for us to suppose that the cruel impulse comes from the drive to seize and emerges in sexual life at a time when the genitals have not yet assumed the role that they will play later. Therefore, it governs a phase of sexual life that we will later describe as pregenital organization. 33 Children who are distinguished by a particular cruelty towards animals and playmates arouse the suspicion, usually confirmed, of a premature sexual practice and intense coming from erogenous zones, and in cases of anticipated and simultaneous maturity of all the sexual drives, the erogenous sexual practice seems to be the primary one. The absence of the barrier of compassion brings with it the danger that this link established in childhood between the cruel and the erogenous drives will prove inseparable later in life. 33. The last two sentences received their present form in 1915. In 1905 and 1910 they read as follows: "We are entitled to assume that cruel impulses flow from sources really independent of sexuality, but that the two may come into temporal connection. Prana, by an anastomosis transverse connection close to its origins. However, observation shows that reciprocal influences persist between sexual development and the drive to see and cruelty, which again restrict the asserted independence between both kinds of drives. Since Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, the painful stimulation of the skin of the buttocks has been recognized by all educators as an erogenous root of the passive drive for cruelty, of masochism. They have rightly deduced from this the requirement that corporal punishment, which almost always affects this part of the body, must be avoided in the case of all those children whose libido, due to the subsequent claims of cultural education, can be pushed towards the collateral pathways. Sexuality. His action corresponds, on the one hand, to a sublimated way of empowerment, and, on the other, he works with the energy of the drive to see. However, its links with sexual life are of particular importance, since through psychoanalyses we have ascertained that the impulse to know in children falls, unexpectedly early and with unexpected intensity, on sexual problems, and perhaps even is aroused by them. The Sphinx's enigma. It is not theoretical interests but practical ones that start up the investigative activity in the child. The threat that the arrival, known or suspected, of a new child means for his conditions of existence, and the fear that this event will deprive him of care and love, make him reflective and penetrating. The first problem that occupies him is, in keeping with this genesis of the awakening of the drive to know, not the question of the difference between the sexes, but the enigma, where do children come from? In a distortion that is easy to undo, this is the same enigma that the Sphinx of Thebes posed. As for the fact of the two sexes, at first the child does not turn against it or oppose any objection. For the little boy it is a natural thing to assume that all people have a genital like his, and it is impossible for him to link his lack to the representation he has of them. Castration complex and penis envy. Little boy clings energetically to this conviction, defends it obstinately in the face of the contradiction that reality very soon opposes him, and abandons it only after serious internal struggles. Castration complex. The substitutive formations of this lost penis of the woman play an important role in the formation of multiple perversions. The assumption that all human beings possess identical, male, genitalia is the first of the astonishing infantile sexual theories, gravid with consequences. It is of little use to the child that biological science gives reason to his prejudice and must recognize the female clitoris as a true substitute for the penis. As for the little girl, she does not incur such rejections when she sees the male's genitals with their different conformation. At once she is willing to admit it, and is seized by penis envy, which culminates in the desire to be a man, a desire so important later. Theories of birth. Many people clearly remember how intensely they were interested in the prepubertal period by this question, where do children come from? The anatomical solutions at that time were of the most diverse types. They come from the chest, are extracted from the belly, or the navel opens to let them pass. 3 As for the research corresponding to the first years of childhood, it is very rare that it be remembered outside of the analysis. It has fallen under repression long ago, but its results were uniform. Children are conceived by having eaten something certain, as in traditional tales, and are delivered through the intestine, like fecal matter. These infantile theories bring to mind modalities of the animal kingdom, especially the cloaca of the zoological types inferior to mammals. Sadistic conception of the sexual commerce. Yes to that. At a tender age, children are spectators of the sexual commerce between adults, which is favored by the conviction of the elders that the little one does not understand anything sexual. He cannot help but conceive the sexual act as a kind of abuse or subjugation, say, in a sadistic sense. From psychoanalysis we learn that such an impression received in early childhood greatly contributes to the readiness for a later sadistic displacement decentering of the sexual goal. In the future children are much concerned with this problem: what can sexual commerce, or as they say being married, consist in? They almost always seek the solution of the secret in some community relationship Gemeinsamkeit provided by the functions of urination or defecation. The typical failure of child sexual research. About infantile sexual theories, this general formulation can be made: they are reflections of the child's own sexual constitution and, despite their grotesque errors, give evidence of a great understanding of sexual processes, greater than would be suspected in its creators. Children also perceive the changes that pregnancy causes in the mother and know how to interpret them correctly. Often they listen with a deep mistrust, although almost always silent, when the fable of the stork is told to them. But since infantile sexual research ignores two elements, the role of the fertilizing semen and the existence of the female sexual opening, the same points, moreover, in which the infantile organization is still retarded, the efforts of the little investigator result in generally unsuccessful and end in a resignation that not rarely leaves as a sequel a permanent deterioration of the drive to know. Early childhood sexual research is always lonely. It implies a first step towards autonomous orientation in the world and establishes a strong estrangement of the child with respect to the people around him, who had previously enjoyed his full confidence. Phases of development of the sexual organization. Until now we have highlighted the following characteristics of infantile sexual life: it is essentially autoerotic, its object is in its own body, and its singular partial drives aspire to achieve pleasure each on its own, entirely disconnected from each other. The point of arrival of development is constituted by the so-called normal sexual life of the adult. In it, the pursuit of pleasure has been placed at the service of the reproduction function, and the partial drives, under the primacy of a single erogenous zone, have formed a solid organization for the achievement of the sexual goal in an alien object. Pregenital organizations. Now, with the help of psychoanalysis we can study the inhibitions and disturbances of this course of development. This allows us to individualize outlines and previous stages of an organization of partial drives such as the one mentioned, which at the same time result in a kind of sexual regime. Normally, these phases of sexual organization go smoothly, betrayed only by a few clues. Only in pathological cases are they activated and become noticeable for coarse observation. We shall call regenital those organizations of sexual life in which the genital zones have not yet attained their hegemonic role. So far we have learned of two of them, which give the impression of relapses into earlier stages of zoological evolution. A first pregenital sexual organization is oral or, if preferred, cannibalic. Sexual activity has not yet been separated from nutrition, nor have opposites been differentiated within it. The object of one activity is also that of the other. The sexual goal consists in the incorporation of the object, the paradigm of what later, as identification, will play such an important psychic role. Sucking can be seen as a remnant of this hypothetical phase that pathology forced us to assume. In it, sexual activity, detached from the activity of eating, has resigned the alien object in exchange for one located in one's own body. A second pregenital phase is that of the sadistic anal organization. Here the division into opposites, which runs through sexual life, has already unfolded. However, they cannot yet be called masculine and feminine, but must be said to be active and passive. The activity is produced by the drive to seize through the musculature of the body, and as an organ of passive sexual goal, the erogenous mucosa of the intestine is constituted above all. However, the objects of these two aspirations do not coincide. Along with this, other partial drives are practiced in an autocratic manner. In this phase, therefore, the sexual polarity and the foreign object are already searchable. The organization and the subordination to the function of reproduction are still missing. The predominance of sadism, and of the anal zone in the role of cloaca, give it a remarkably archaic bias. Furthermore, it has this other character: the pairs of drive opposites are embodied in approximately the same degree, a state of affairs which is designated by the happy term introduced by Bleuler, ambivalence. The hypothesis of the pregenital organizations of the sexual life rests on the analysis of the neuroses. It can hardly be appreciated if it is not in relation to knowledge of these. We have the right to hope that continued analytical efforts will provide us with much more extensive data on the construction and development of normal sexual function. To complete the picture of infantile sexual life, it must be added that often or regularly, already in childhood, an object choice such as the one we have assumed to be characteristic of the developmental phase of puberty is consummated. The set of sexual desires are addressed to a unique person, and in her they want to reach their goal. Here, then, is the closest possible approach in childhood to the definitive conformation that sexual life will present after puberty. The difference with respect to the latter resides only in the fact that the unification of the partial drives and their subordination to the primacy of the genitals are not established in childhood, or are so in a very incomplete way. Therefore, the establishment of this primacy at the service of reproduction is the last phase that the sexual organization goes through. Point 4. The 2 times of the choice of object. The following process can claim the name of typical. The object choice is made in 2 stages, in 2 waves. The first begins between the ages of 2 and 5, and the latency period stops it or makes it regress. He is characterized by the childish nature of his sexual goals. Subsequently, 1923, I have modified this exposition inserting, after the 2 pregenital organizations in the child's development, a 3rd phase. This already deserves the name of the genital phase. It shows a sexual object and a certain degree of convergence of the sexual aspirations towards this object, but it differs in an essential point from the definitive organization of reproductive maturity. Indeed, it knows only one class of genitals, the male. Now then, the facts related to the double time of the choice of the object, which are essentially reduced to the effect of the latency period, acquire great importance as far as the disturbance of this final state is concerned. The results of the child's choice of object continue into a late period. Either they are kept as is, or they undergo a renewal at the time of puberty. But they prove to be inapplicable, and this as a result of the development of the repression, which is situated between both phases. His sexual goals have undergone a tempering, and they feature only what we can call the tender current of sexual life. Only psychoanalytic inquiry is capable of investigating, hidden behind that tenderness, that veneration, and that respect, the old sexual aspirations, now unusable, of the infantile partial drives. The object choice of the period of puberty has to renounce childish objects and start anew as a sensual current. The non-confluence of the 2 currents often has the effect of not being able to reach one of the ideals of sexual life, the unification of all desires in one object. As a result of the investigation of the erogenous zones, we have discovered that these sectors of the skin merely show a particular intensification of a type of excitability that, to a certain degree, is typical of the entire surface of the skin. That is why we will not be surprised to learn that certain types of general stimulation of the skin can be ascribed very clear erogenous effects. Among these, we highlight above all thermal stimuli. Perhaps this will help us understand the therapeutic effect of hot baths. Mechanical excitations. In addition, we have to include in this series the production of sexual arousal through mechanical shaking of the body, of a rhythmic nature. We must distinguish in them 3 classes of stimulus influences: those that act on the sensory apparatus of the vestibular nerves, those that act on the skin, and those that act on the deep parts, muscles, joint apparatus. The existence of the pleasurable sensations thus generated, it is worth noting that we are authorized to use interchangeably, for a whole stretch, sexual arousal and satisfaction, although we thus force ourselves to provide an explanation later on. The existence of these pleasant sensations, then, produced by certain mechanical shocks of the body, is documented by the great pleasure that children feel in games of passive movement, like being hammocked and thrown through the air, whose repetition they incessantly ask for. As is well known, restless children are regularly rocked to sleep. The jolts of carriages and, later, of the railway have such a fascinating effect on older children that at least every little boy has once wanted to be a coachman or train conductor when he grows up. They usually give an enigmatic interest, of extraordinary intensity, to everything related to the railway, and at the age when the fantasy is activated, shortly before puberty, they usually make it the nucleus of a refined sexual symbolism. It is evident that the compulsion to establish this link between the railway journey and sexuality stems from the pleasurable character of the sensations of movement. And if repression is added later, which makes so many of the childhood predilections take a turn for the worse. Turned towards its opposite, these same people will react in their adolescence or maturity with nausea if they are rocked, or else a trip by railway will exhaust them terribly, or they will tend to suffer anxiety attacks in case of traveling, and they will protect themselves from the repetition of that ordeal through anguish to the railway. To this series belongs the still misunderstood fact that severe hysteriform traumatic neurosis is produced by the summation of terror and mechanical shock. At least it can be assumed that these influences, which in minimal intensities become a source of sexual arousal, in excessive measure cause a profound disturbance of the sexual mechanism or chemistry. Muscle activity. It is known that an intense muscular activity constitutes for the child a need from the satisfaction of which he derives extraordinary pleasure. It is subject to critical elucidations to determine whether this pleasure has something to do with sexuality, whether it itself includes sexual satisfaction or can become the occasion of sexual arousal. These elucidations can also point to the thesis already exposed, namely, that the pleasure caused by the sensations of passive movement is of a sexual nature or generates sexual arousal. It is a fact, however, that many people report having experienced the first signs of arousal in their genitals in the course of violent games or fights with their playmates, a situation in which, in addition to all the muscular effort, operating close contact with the opponent's skin, the inclination to engage in a fight with a certain person through the musculature, as in later years the inclination to engage in disputes through words, hate is love, is among the good announcing signs that that person has been chosen as the object. One of the roots of the sadistic drive should be recognized in the promotion of sexual arousal through muscular activity. For many individuals, the childhood link between rough play and sexual arousal is a codeterminant of orientation preference that will print later on his sexual drive. Affective processes. The other sources of sexual arousal in the child raise less doubt. It is easy to verify by means of simultaneous observation or retrospective exploration that the most intense affective processes, even the terrifying excitations, spill over onto sexuality. This, moreover, can contribute to the understanding of the pathogenic effect of these movements of the mind. In the school, the anguish before an exam, the tension caused by a task that is difficult to solve, can become important, not only with regard to their relationship with the school but also for the outbreak of sexual manifestations. In such circumstances, in fact, it is quite frequent that a stimulating feeling arises that urges contact with the genitals, or a process of the type of pollution, with all its embarrassing consequences. Children's behavior at school, which poses many puzzles to teachers, generally deserves to be linked to their incipient sexuality. The sexually arousing effect of many feelings that are unpleasant in themselves, such as anxiety, shuddering with fear, or fright, persists in a large number of human beings during their adult lives, and it undoubtedly explains why many people wait for the opportunity to receive such sensations, subject only to certain concomitant circumstances, belonging to a fictional world, reading, theater, that lessen the seriousness of the sensation of displeasure. If it is legitimate to suppose that sensations of intense pain also cause the same erogenous effect, especially when the pain is lessened or removed by a concomitant condition, this relationship would constitute one of the main roots of the sadomasochistic drive, into whose multiple composition we are thus little penetrating. Little by little. Intellectual work. Finally, it is undeniable that the concentration of attention on an intellectual task, and, in general, the mental effort, has as a consequence in many people, both young and more mature, a concomitant sexual excitement. We must consider it the only legitimate basis for the thesis, otherwise so dubious, that it leads to the derivation of nervous disturbances from a mental overwork. If now, After these examples and indications that we have not communicated in a complete or exhaustive way in terms of their number, we take a panoramic look at the sources of infantile sexual arousal. We glimpse or recognize the following general features. Multiple reassurances seem to ensure the implementation of the process of sexual arousal whose nature, it is true, has just become enigmatic to us. Above all, they take care of it, more or less directly, the excitations of the sensitive surfaces, the skin and the sense organs, and in the most immediate way, the stimulations of certain sectors that have to be defined as erogenous zones. With respect to these sources of sexual arousal, the quality of the stimulus is undoubtedly the decisive factor, although the factor of intensity, in the case of pain, is not entirely indifferent. But, in addition, devices pre-exist in the organism as a result of which sexual arousal is generated as a side effect, as a result of a great series of internal processes, for which it is enough that their intensity exceeds certain quantitative limits. What we have called partial drives of sexuality, either derives directly from these internal sources of sexual arousal is made up of inputs from these sources and from the erogenous zones. It is possible that nothing of any importance occurs in the organism that does not yield its components to the excitation of the sexual drive. It does not seem possible for now to bring more clarity and certainty to these general theses. I hold two factors responsible for this: firstly, the novelty of the entire approach, and, secondly, the circumstance that the nature of sexual arousal is completely unknown to us. I would not, however, want to give up two observations that promise to open up vast perspectives. Various sexual constitution. As before, we saw the possibility of basing the various innate sexual constitutions on the different expression of the erogenous zones. Now we can try the same thing by including the indirect sources of sexual arousal. It is legitimate for us to assume that these sources provide their contribution to all individuals, but that they do not have the same intensity in all of them. It can be admitted, then, that the privileged representation of each one of the sources of sexual arousal. It also helps to differentiate the various sexual constitutions. Pathways of interreciprocal influence. If we abandon the figurative expressions we have used for so long, and stop talking about sources of sexual arousal, we can arrive at this conjecture: all the pathways of connection that lead to sexuality from other functions must also be traversable in the reverse direction. Here is an example: if the fact that the area of the lips is the common heritage of the two functions is the basis for which nutrition generates sexual satisfaction, this same factor allows us to understand that nutrition suffers disturbances when erogenous functions are disturbed. From the common area. And once we know that the concentration of attention is capable of producing sexual arousal, this leads us to suppose that acting in the same way, only in the opposite direction, the state of sexual arousal influences the availability of orientable attention. A good part of the symptomatology of the neuroses, which I derive from disturbances of the sexual processes, manifests itself in disturbances of the other, non-sexual, functions of the body. And this influence, hitherto incomprehensible, will be made less enigmatic by admitting that it represents the counterpart of the influences that preside over the production of sexual arousal. However, those same paths through which sexual disturbances spill over onto the other functions of the body would serve another important achievement in the state of health. Through them the attraction of the sexual drive forces towards other, non-sexual, goals would be consummated, that is to say, the sublimation of sexuality. We cannot help but conclude by confessing that we still know very little with certainty about these routes, undoubtedly existing and probably passable in both directions. End. Child sexuality. Sigmund Freud.